how many coaches in the class of coach that is in the SEC West, forget the entire conference, but in the SEC West. And as we continue to talk about coaches, there's been a prevailing storyline this offseason that has driven me absolutely nuts. And it drives me nuts because it's also what makes me fall in love with this sport to begin with. And it's the passion of the people. It's the passion of the fans. And it's, you need to win this game to prove to us that you are still worthy of this job. But can we please stop? Can we just stop the narrative that Ryan Day is in trouble because he's lost to Michigan 2 years in a row? I don't want to hear it. I don't want that story to be out there. He could have beaten Georgia in the playoffs, which I know he didn't, but he could have beaten Georgia in the playoffs. You could argue they were the most talented team in the country, top to bottom. I don't care that he's lost to Michigan twice. He is a top flight head coach that's got Ohio State in contention every year. Paul, stop it with that. And I'm not saying you, I'm talking in generality.
Yeah, I'll tell you why everything you just said is true, and why everything you just said is going to go on deaf ears. I was with you Friday on SportsCenter, and I didn't say I think Ryan Day is on the hot seat. I said if he loses to Michigan, according to some people, pretty important phrase there I used, he will be on the hot seat. Matt, I know you have better things to do than read Twitter all weekend, but I don't. And I saw on countless websites, Feinbaum says Ryan Day on the hot seat, stupidest take of the year. Well, what does that mean? That means that the media out there is just desperate for a big story. And that is a big story. The fact that some goofball mentioned it on SportsCenter on Friday afternoon. And Matt, that game does matter. And I frankly think they are going to exceed even the expectations that they have this year for all the reasons that you've laid out. But you can't really move a program forward at a level like Ryan Day has done and lose again to your biggest opponent. By the way, I'm not suggesting he gets fired. That is absurd. I mean, he's what is he still in single digit losses? He's played for a championship and been to the playoffs a few times, but you and I don't control the narratives out there, and we do help the narratives.
We can try.
Yeah, and by the way, when you can't give a take anymore about Ryan Day without somebody misinterpreting it. But I'm an adult. I get it. I brought it up. Nobody forced me to use the word hot seat. But it won't be the last time you hear that take.
Is it because because when you look at Michigan, you got to go to Ann Arbor for the story because that's where this narrative stops and starts. It's Jim Harbaugh, it's Michigan, and it's that I believe Harbaugh has now consistently elevated Michigan into the conversation if they are going to be a top 7 team year in and year out. I just firmly believe that. Now, if it doesn't stop his dalliances with the NFL, then maybe that continues to impact it, but it hasn't to this point. I believe the reason the Ryan Day thing is such a topic, one, 2 years in a row he's lost to him, but Paul, 2, Michigan's been in the playoff 2 years in a row. It's not just enough that Michigan's beaten Ohio State, because in any other year that would be enough to get Columbus fired up. It's that now Harbaugh has Michigan in a position year in and year out to take what Ohio State believes is theirs, which is the Big Ten championship and a spot in the playoff, and then ultimately a spot in the national championship game.
Well, that's it. The Big Ten championship 2 years in a row, the playoffs, and that does not go well in Columbia. I would argue that Columbia and probably
Columbus
are the two toughest fan bases to appease when things aren't going well, because they're identical fan bases in many ways, where Michigan fans are a little bit different. But aside from all that, Ryan Day should have had a national championship by now. I would argue, going back in time, Urban Meyer underachieved with only one national championship during his tenure. He missed out a couple of times. The year after the national championship in 2015 with Ezekiel Elliott, when they lost that game to Michigan State, they had the best team in the country that year.
Loaded.
And Buckeye fans understand that. So they do hold their coach to a high level. And I mean, you can't help but feel badly for Ryan Day, but okay, what are we talking about? I heard more about a loss in the offseason. Every time I'm in New York or Washington or somewhere else in the country, I had a Buckeye. Well, that field goal, I don't care about that field goal. You lost the game, move on, okay?
we were sitting there, and there's always this debate because it was a few years ago now, where you could argue Alabama had the best wide receiver room in the history of college football. And then I'm on the other day on Sports Center with Jordan Reed, one of our NFL draft scouts. And I looked back at him. I said, do you realize that in one receiver room, Ohio State had Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, Jackson Smith and Jigba, and Marvin Harrison Jr.? And that, to me, when you look at that and some of the other Chase Young, some of the other first-round picks, C.J. Stroud, Justin Fields, you could argue now that in the tail end of the Ryan or the Urban Meyer era and now in the Ryan Day era, Paul, I think it's possible that Ohio State, top to bottom, if you're playing this thing on roster and paper, has had the most talented roster in college football for the better part of 5 years. And I think that's another reason people start questioning the Ryan Day experience, that he's got NFL talent oozing out of that helmet, yet it hasn't resulted in a national championship yet.
Without a doubt. And Matt, we live in a hot take society. Do I need to tell you, considering where you work? Just walk up and down the hallway during the mid morning hours, and they're an easy target too. But I mean, we're not talking about some garden variety program here. And when you have enormous talent, you are held accountable. I mean, I used to I ran into Steve Spurrier one time when he was still coaching at South Carolina, and he said, what happened to your buddy Saban? I said, what do you mean? They lost a national championship game. He said, how did they ever lose? And it was a pretty good point when you look at the talent there between 2009 and until probably about 2 years ago. They always had the most talent. Ohio State is now probably in that realm. And I think Georgia, I mean, we essentially have three programs right now that, I mean, how many teams between Georgia, Alabama, and Ohio State? I mean, you could divvy up about 8 or 9 rosters.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. For live streaming sports and premium content, subscribe to ESPN Plus.